factors he describes two kinds: doubt, fear, anxiety, being what he calls the negative kind, what he calls their positive or noble counterweights: courage, confidence, and esprit. And he says you don't know which way that's going to go one way or the other, so it can either impede or stimulate. One day they may appeal to one, the other day they may appeal to another. Then he does a very interesting thing. All these activities interact with many factors, including all these above, which throws in complexity, lack of knowledge, etc., that tends to impede war. He calls that friction. Friction interacts with many factors that impedes activity. And then he makes a very famous statement. He says, friction is the only concept that more or less corresponds to those factors that distinguish real war from war on paper. The only concept that distinguishes real war from war on paper. The point is, if you don't account for the idea of friction, you're talking about something other than war. You should look at some of the computer models we have in the Pentagon. We don't even think about it. And then they wonder why the models don't play out too well. Because they don't bring in the human factor. When you're dealing with the human factor, you're dealing with friction. Even in the physics, but particularly human beings. Then he goes on and states, the climate or atmosphere of war is friction. And it's a thread that goes through all this treatise. Some people don't pick it up, and you read it, you see it just shows up again and again. As a matter of fact, in a sense what it is, it's a precursor to a modern concept of what I call the second law of thermodynamics. And you've heard the term, many of you, entropy. Friction and entropy, same kind of thing. And if you look at the way he states, the way he uses it, you look at the way they talk about the modern second law, very, very similar. Very powerful notion, very important notion. Then he says, how can you overcome this friction? He says, really, one best way is by experience. Another one is having a particularly brilliant commander, whether it be Alexander, Napoleon, etc. And he says, if you have that brilliant commander, he describes him as a genius for war. Those people that can overcome that friction and deal with that complexity. And if you have that individual, he changes the nature, magnifies the scope of operation. He can't change the character of war, but he can certainly do that. And then his strategy related to that, note this, he exhausts enemy by influencing him to increase expenditure revenue. Keep that in mind. And note this one, another very important concept. Seek out those centers of gravity upon which the other guy's movements, what he does, depends upon. And try to make him trace him back to as few as possible. Ideally one, if you can find that one center of gravity, and go after that one. And then to drive that point home, he said, in this activity, compress all effort against those centers into the fewest possible actions, ideally one again. And he shoves it one more time. Subordinate all minor secondary actions in all this activity. What's his point? What he's trying to do, these are very much in harmony with his idea in friction. He's trying to reduce his own internal friction to deal with his adversary. And then we already described the importance of speed. Also, go after the major battle will promise a decisive victory, what he calls a decisive battle. And his aim is very simple. In his own words, render the enemy powerless defensively. With emphasis on destruction of his armed forces. That wasn't the only way, but that was the emphasis. On destruction of his armed forces. Another way is to grab a piece of territory. Another way was to destroy his will. He emphasized destruction of his armed forces. Good question.
It sounds like equal distribution. Go against the centers, and then...
No. He said, find what you do is look at its centers, find that one center that describes you more than anything else, and go after that one center. Reducing the fewest possible, ideally one. Then he says, compress all effort against those centers in the fewest possible actions, ideally one. Know what you're saying? One more. Then he said, subordinate all minor secondary actions as much as possible. In a sense, if you look at that, you could call that concentration. Remember, he's going against few centers, few actions. That's what he's talking about. And some people have interpreted straight concentration. They don't read the richness of this comment. As a result, they don't see into it. Better word would be focus. Trying to get a focus. Concentration is running. Focus is better than running. Focus. You'll see we'll use that later on. We'll work our way through. Okay, with that in mind now, you're on to something there. Let's critique Napoleon. Clouding. If we critique Clausewitz, we note that for one thing, he tended to overemphasize or overplay the idea of decisive battle, tend to underplay strategic maneuver. And you can understand why, particularly at the time. Remember, he actually, in a sense, was reacting against that 18th century warfare where they tried to do all these elegant maneuvers and they made no decisions. So, somewhat of an overreaction. The other thing, Clausewitz emphasized method and routine at the tactical level. As a matter of fact, he had a chapter on method and routine. And he wanted to tackle them in his own words to reduce his own internal friction. His own words. Why? Clausewitz was very much concerned with trying to overcome or reduce friction and uncertainty. Unfortunately, he didn't turn the argument around. He failed to address the idea, why not try to magnify your adversary's friction and uncertainty? It's not that the former is wrong, you want to look at it both ways. Remember, if you reduce your own, and you're not looking at his, you may also help your adversary too, relative to you. You gotta look at it both ways all the time. Clausewitz was also concerned with trying to exhaust his adversary by influencing him to increase his expenditure. Once again, he didn't turn that argument around. He failed to address the idea, why not try to paralyze your adversary by denying him even the opportunity to expend any of it? Now we see a difference between he and Sun Tzu. Clausewitz, in a sense, was trying to keep himself from being driven bananas. Sun Tzu was trying to drive his adversary bananas. Or using Clausewitz's term, Clausewitz was trying to reduce his own friction and uncertainty, whereas Sun Tzu was concentrating trying to magnify his adversary's friction and uncertainty. As a matter of fact, you read Sun Tzu, he's doing both. He's worrying about his own plus his adversary. And it's richer in that sense. I mean, he didn't use the word friction, but the idea is there. Friction is Clausewitz's word. And then Clausewitz made an incorrect statement. Quote, the center of gravity is always found where the mass is concentrated most densely. That's not always true. The center of gravity in a donut's in the hole. There is no mass. Or in a hollow steel ball, it's where the steel isn't. Or in a dumbbell, it's in the connection between the two masses. They come up with all kinds of counterexamples. And somebody said, wait a minute here, that might be a cheap shot. He might not appeal to that definition there. That's strict. That's correct. But let's look and see how he did appeal. And then he argued that is where the place, then he failed. Then he argued that's where the blow should be and where the decision should be reached, at center of gravity. But then he gave three examples of centers of gravity. The army, the capital, and public opinion. He followed up the army and the capital, didn't follow up public opinion. That was a mistake. Because public opinion depends upon what? The connection of one against the other. That's the thing you people deal with. And if you disrupt those connections, you generate many non-cooperative centers of gravity. And that's my point. He failed to develop the idea of generating many non-cooperative centers of gravity by striking at those connections that permit a larger center of gravity to exist. Follow up. So raise a rather interesting question. What does all this mean? I made this big argument. Where the hell am I going? So let's invert the argument. Once again, very often you get insight from the invert. So once again, let's invert the argument. So let's assume that we can generate many non-cooperative centers of gravity in our adversary system. If we can do that, then we deprive him of the opportunity to expend effort. That's the same thing with paralysis. If we paralyze him, we impede vigorous operations. That's the definition of friction. We magnify friction. So if we can generate many non-cooperative centers of gravity in the system, we deprive him the opportunity to operate in a directed way, which paralyzes, which impedes vigorous activity, which defines friction, magnifies friction. He didn't draw a real good connection between friction and center of gravity. And we saw one way. In any case, if you paste all that together, here's the message. So then pretty soon things begin to see what happens. If you're trying to have your methods routine the same, the other guy's the same, pretty soon you get these nice, well-regulated battles and strength going against strength. It's a bloodbath. Depending on how you interpret it. You want to read into these very carefully. Okay, with that in mind, let's look at Jomini. Jomini lived a long time, born in 1779, died in 1869 after the Civil War. And he wrote his treatise, The Art of War, in 1836, also 1836, 1838. And around 1861, we find these comments where he's describing the ideas he had in mind when he wrote that. I'll let you read it. dominate word. So you see the Battle of White grabbed his attention. He saw some important idea there. Also, later, early on in Lutheran, he tied right back to the victories of Frederick and also tied the victories of Napoleon himself. He trying to get leverage your adversary. So then, with this in mind, let's break out his art of war in that context. In order to sort of have this notion of the key idea he had in mind, so we outline his art of war, we can do it. We'll go to 1836. His key idea was to generalize the like order associated battles of Lutheran play. And then he said in your mind's eye you want to divide the front or the theater up into three parts, the subdivision. 2 wings in the center. Or he said, not so ideally, 2 wings, or 2 wings on left and right center. In other words, it's a mental mechanism so you can kind of determine how you want to allocate the forces relative to your adversary so you can gain that leverage. And the key idea, gain leverage in terms of what? Those Lutheran light strategic and grand tactical maneuvers. That's what he's trying to do. And then he recognized the importance of your lines of communication, your bases and your lines of operations, lines of communication. He said you want to set up your bases of operations such that you can shape and shift your operation. In other words, so you can feed these strategic and grand tactical maneuvers so you can gain leverage over your adversary. So he said you can set up your bases accordingly in order to try to do that. But you people know, in a physical sense, he's talking about what? A support base. In politics, you have to have a support base. In anything, you have to have a support base. But he's talking about a physical support base. Okay, so if you pull these things together, then we begin to see strategy and grand tactics. Note this statement: by free and rapid movement, carry both of the forces against fractions of the adversary. So you see the idea of speed, you see the idea of strength against weakness. Then he said, strike in the most decisive direction, go against the center or one wing or both simultaneously. I have to caveat this because I'm talking about 2 aspects, strategy and grand tactics. If you're operating a large strategic arena, you can go against the center or one wing, but not both simultaneously, because otherwise you may be defeated separately in detail. But if you're operating a grand tactical sense, you're in a smaller region, then you can go against one or the other or both, because you have the time and ability to adapt. Okay, then note this, straight Napoleonic. If possible, grab his communication. Also, he said, without losing your own. The idea is to cut him off, deny him reinforcement, cause him to fight under unfavorable circumstances. Straight Napoleonic. Remember, he was a Napoleonic general. And note this one. If the enemy's forces are too much extended, remember Napoleon's central position, split them up, take out one, then the other. And note this one, just like Patton, hold him by the nose and take him in the rear. Go out flank and turn a wing. Hit the enemy in the flank and also contain him at the front. Hold him by the nose and kick him in the rear. Now, this last one I want to comment on. Note this, an attack can be made simultaneously on both extremities, but not if you're inferior to your adversary. There's too many counterexamples to that. We already cited a couple of them. Cannae, Marathon, Napoleon in Dresden. He was outnumbered by his adversary, did a double envelopment scheme, and succeeded. So that really doesn't hold up. Then, in an absolute sense, but in a relative sense, it does hold up. Unfortunately, he didn't make it clear what he was speaking of. Basically, what he was doing, he was comparing a double envelopment or double outflanking versus single envelopment, single outflanking versus loop or lightning. And basically, what he really meant to say was, look, with the same force, I can get more leverage out of a single envelopment scheme than I can with a double envelopment. Or I can afford to lose less force with a single envelopment scheme, and I get the same effect I would out of a double envelopment with a larger force. They're equivalent statements. And we'll see later on the Germans, in many of the Blitzkrieg activities, particularly Manstein and some of the others, were very gifted in terms of interpreting and using that. And then he said to make evident, his aim was to make evident the secret for success more. It wasn't literally a secret. All he's trying to do is give you a way of dealing with this complex activity, what's going on and how you can deal with it so you can cope and adapt. Okay, with that in mind, let's critique Germany. He was very much preoccupied with the form of operations, arrangement of bases, formal orders of battle, etc. That's not so good, because what does that do? You tend to become less adaptable, more predictable. Rigidity begins to creep. Also, we have a lack of appreciation for the use of swarms of guerrillas and skirmishers. In fact, he tend to put them down. Comments on it. And what they tend to do, in other words, to master your own activities and also to confuse and disorder the enemy. And the likely result, operations become stereotyped unless you can appreciate his ideas outside their formal underpinnings. Now, if you take those formal underpinnings and pull them away, then there's some nice fluidity and adaptability in his operation. But if you tend to retain that, then you tend to be less adaptable, more predictable. In other words, throw away the lattice work. After you create the picture, you don't leave the lattice there in order to screw up the picture. Same thing. And that's it. Well, if you've been following me, you've been tracking what I've been saying about Napoleon, Clausewitz, and now Jomini, you should have detected something. They all, in a sense, had the same blind spot. If you look at all three. All three of them did not appreciate the importance of loose, irregular tactical arrangements, lower-level arrangements. Loose, irregular. Remember? Clausewitz, worried about method routine. Napoleon, 1791 drill regulations, Clausewitz method routine, and now we see Jomini, some of the same track. Why did they have this blind spot? Because all three of them tended to view the conduct of war from top down, emphasizing adaptability at the top and regularity at the bottom. As a matter of fact, a couple of years ago, an Army colonel got up and said, "Boy, that's all wrong. You don't have it right. That's an incorrect statement. Proceed." He had a beautiful straight man. Nice what he did. He said, "Because today we have regularity at both top and bottom." So I always use that. I said, this is one of the pervasive effects. You know you're all wrong. We have regularity at both top and bottom. Now here's a personal experience. As a matter of fact, if you look at our modern command and control systems, they tend to do that. I'll get into that later on. I don't want to preempt myself too much. Because the way we construct our command and control system, that does impose irregularity. We say it isn't there, but it really is. Causes some problems. Because we tend to articulate it in terms of our high technology. We can have all these fusion centers, communication centers. In order to make that work, people tend to do things in very rigid recipes. Go ahead.
Was the regularity at the bottom of their tactics imposed by the general, or was it sort of the chicken and the egg routine that they have rather low quality troops, so on and so forth?
Just a minute. You're preempting me. I'm just going to talk about that. I'm just setting this up. I'm going to talk about it right now. Just hang on to the answer question. Now recall, we critiqued Napoleon, remember? We said, you know, he got hung up and said he tended to have the tactical regularity. We see the same thing. So the question is, why did this occur? Which is your question. There's a number of things you can offer. One, remember, even though we had the Napoleonic Revolution, which tended to pull these things apart, Napoleon later on reinstalled himself as emperor. Also, remember the period that both he, Clausewitz, and Jomini came out of. They came out of the 18th century, the age of aristocracy, where they want to have adaptability at the top and regularity at the bottom. So in other words, they're imprinted by their culture. We tend to get, you don't even realize, you tend to get imprinted by your culture, then you make decisions based upon that culture. Let me give you an example. This is not going to be a charitable example, sort of. I'm going to hit you over the shoulders with this one a little bit. People like ideology. I call it ideology. It's closer to being idiot. The reason being, if you use ideology as a screening device, then what you're doing, you're denying yourself the opportunity to see things from a different perspective. It's a filtering device. Well, if you've been imprinted by a culture and you see things a certain way, that's another aspect you can think of as sort of an ideology too. So it's a screening device so you don't see things the other way. You've been imprinted. We're all imprinted by our culture. There has some certain value there. If you're not imprinted by a culture, you're going to be confused and disordered all your life. You have to have certain constancies and things in your life so you can deal with variety. But then if you impose those constancies in certain situations such that you can't adapt, then you tend to screen out things you need to know. So even Napoleon himself, who was a creature of the revolution, reinstalled the aristocracy, because remember, his culture is also from the 18th century, which is the aristocracy. You have to keep that in mind. There's some other features, I just wanted to bring that in. Another reason why you could say why Napoleon did, that's one thing, is remember, after he became emperor and he started conquering all his various countries and installing his own puppets or his own people there, as the case may be, he also depended upon these other countries for a troop levy. And so then, in order to get them to work together, he started imposing more and more rigidity. In fact, you can go back to Frederick the Great. He said, hell, he didn't even like to march his army near a wood because he said half of them would desert. They want to keep them in formation. So they're concerned about their troops. So by putting that regularity on was to keep track of them, be sure they showed up for the battle or showed up for their assignment. I want you to keep that in mind. We'll come back to later on in different contexts. So these are the kind of things that are going on. The culture, the fact that these people didn't have a PhD action. The only way you get them to do something is rather onerous and sharp techniques you use upon them. Uniformity or rigidity. But then when you do that, you also make yourself less adaptable, and also less predictable. More predictable. There's always, remember, you got to look at these things from different sides. You may get one benefit, but you also may get a detriment somewhere else. You want to keep track of that. You want to have values. You want to have things you believe in, but you want to think about those all the time. By doing this, hey, am I hosing myself over here? Do I have any workarounds? If I don't have any workarounds, I better start rethinking the problem. You can be committed to something. Remember, if you're going to do something, there may be some disadvantage. Then you can say, well, maybe I can still retain that. I might have some workarounds. Still get me. You want to look for those. Just don't say bullshit. We're going to continue on. How many times have you been in a meeting where you've been in a discussion? This is an important point with people, and maybe a new idea comes out, and the guy says, "Oh, bullshit." He won't even think about it. See, he's got a structure in his mind, and he's got a yes-no system there, and that thing didn't fit that, so he says, no. He's evaluating according to the structure he's got in his mind. It may not even be the right context to evaluate it. You've got to bring it on. You say, okay, let that guy talk a little bit. Let's see what that structure is. It might be valuable, and then again, it may be bullshit. I've seen people, we used to call him Dr. No. That's Dr. No. He'll always say no. Doesn't fit. It's imprinted in his brain. Think about it for a while first. What you're doing, you're being given the opportunity, maybe or maybe not, to look at something from a different vantage point, which means allow you to widen your variety, which means then you can use it for leverage. And if you're restricted, you narrow your variety, somebody's going to leverage you then. We talked about that at the beginning. Very important. Okay. With that in mind, we find out there are a number of people who talked about war at that time, and some people were affected by the Napoleonic experience. One of these gentlemen was a guy by the name of Schalk, is in the emo Schalk was affected here. He was actually in Philadelphia, note the date, Philadelphia. 1862. What he did, he took all this stuff, he said he reduced the science of war to 3 great maxims. Here they are. Let's read it, his words. During the Civil War. Now, granted, one thing you want to keep in mind here, as we're working our way forward, so far, except when we talked about fighter pilots, we're tending to treat war, except for maybe the way Clausewitz looked at it. Remember, he looked at the psychological and the moral. We tend to think of it very much in a physical sense, and notice it's very much in a physical sense where he's describing it. That's one thing. The other thing is caution. He really doesn't address it down like this. These are my words, down at the tactical level. He hasn't come to grips with the tactical level yet, the problems they've had. Okay? With that in mind, let's look at another impact of the 19th century. The so-called rise of modern technology and its impact upon war. We begin to see the emergence of railroad telegraphs, foot-fire artillery, machine guns, repeating rifles, barbed wire and trenches. It's all coming out in the 19th century, latter half of the 19th century. So what do we see in terms of trend? Emphasis toward mass firepower and large armies supported by rail logistics. They had it, so they dump all this firepower in there and use that as a basis for decision. Increased emphasis on holding defense and flanking or wide turning maneuvers. In other words, hold back and sneak in the back door. But still not at the tactical level, the use of these frontal assaults, large stereotype formations, trying to blow their way through. And the result's not too surprising. You tend to suppress ambiguity, deception, mobility. You suppress this, you suppress surprise, what do you get then? Bloodbath. Because these are the kind of ingredients you need in order to generate some progress. So let's tie a few of these things together. Let's couple that, the idea of modern technology or the rise of 19th century technology, that with the ideas of Napoleon, Clausewitz, and John. Tie that together and you see what happens here. These things tend to feed upon one another. In other words, I've repeated these words. You tend to suppress ambiguity, deception, and mobility, particularly down to tactical level. Therefore, you're unable to generate that surprise. And it was done in all these wars. Civil War all the way down to World War I. So in that sense, technology down to tactical is being used as a crude club trying to beat your adversary over the head. Now, if you look, like in the Civil War, people like to criticize Grant very heavily. His Vicksburg maneuver was very, real neat strategic maneuver. And he, in conjunction with Sherman, laid on a nice strategic maneuver when he was actually he was playing the chain, holding Lee up north, so Sherman could go crashing through the south there. The strategic maneuver, cut the south again in half. But tactically, it was high to the middle, up the middle, and blowing people away, both sides. Didn't make any difference whether it was a long war or a short war. See, so Grant's been criticized, but primarily at the tactical level. But he was no different than other people. They're all doing it. That's my point then. Evolution of tactics did not keep pace with the increased weapons lethality developed and produced by that 19th century technology. So it raised a rather interesting question. Why were the 19th century and early 20th century commanders unable to evolve better tactics to cope with those ingredients that technology produced? In other words, that lethality of those weapons. They didn't. We're going to pretend right now we're still back in the 19th century. We can't answer that question. We're going to answer it. We're back in the 19th century. We don't know the answer either right now. I want to show you some more events where people did cope with it and how they did. Just find the answer, but it didn't get answered until the latter part of World War I. And we'll bring that out. Right now I'm going to let the question stand. We will address it. But I want to bring that to your attention. Okay, with that in mind, there's another thing that showed up in the 19th century. After this, we'll take our break. So we not only have 19th century technology, but 19th century technology also brought about something we call like Marxism. In other words, the impact of 19th century capitalism on what today we call insurrection and revolution. And this is with a Marxian flavor. Remember, I just put on a Marxian hat. I'm a dirty son of a bitch. I'm on the other side. You got to look at the other guy's culture from his viewpoint. That's why I call it with a Marxian flavor. We're going to look at it from their viewpoint and see what we can pull out. I'll let you read it and then I'll comment on it. We all became Marxists when we read it. Now notice a couple things. What we begin to see now is not conflict between social systems, but conflict within a social system. Is the modern brutal worker? Of course. Leading up to that in mind. Also, we see these things, we start talking about things like crises and vanguard. You see it very often in their literature, the idea of a crisis and vanguard. Yet we see in our depiction of modern brutal worker, they don't even bring that out. I said, read theirs. They're the ones that are doing it to us. See it from their viewpoint. You might get an insight. Note that we're talking about crises and vanguards, so underline that. So it raises a rather interesting question. How should such an unpleasant situation be corrected? We'll look at it once again. We'll keep our Marxian hat on. Looking at it from their viewpoint. And after you read this, I'll comment on both these charts. Note what I depict, necessary conditions for success, both the crises and vanguard. You get the crisis, that allows you to build the vanguard. The vanguard then can exacerbate the crises builds up even more vanguard, now you got an incestuous feedback loop, you pull the whole thing apart. So look at that. Crises then represent the height of confusion disorder and the idea of generating many non-cooperative centers of gravity in a guy's system. In other words, pumping up his internal friction, the inverse Clausewitzian notion. So they are periods of bumping weakness. Then the vanguard can exploit that, cause more instability, more crises, which feed the vanguard, so now you got the thing going where the whole thing comes unglued, you got it all. Oversimplified form. And it's really interesting when you read the Russian documents or you read the Marxian flavor in the modern sense, how they bring out the ideas of vanguards, crises, you know, they're talking about guerrilla warfare and all this stuff. Very important. So I'm trying to say, in a sense, they are the golden keys for one to penetrate into the idea of insurrection, revolution, guerrilla warfare, insurgency, etc. But think about it, when you're really talking about crises, you're trying to disrupt or destroy those ties that make a society, generate those non-cooperative centers of gravity, and pump up that internal friction so they can't function as an organic whole. Which is that inverse Clausewitzian notion. Okay? Now let's glue it all together, up to this point. So we have here then, we look at capitalism, technology, and the conduct of war. Sort of a quick summary. In other words, start taking the society apart from within. How can we use these notions? In order to do that, we have to go to World War I, World War II, and their aftermath. We'll do that after. We'll be back after lunch. Before we got into the afternoon part of the presentation, are there any questions you might have had this morning, or are you still trying to muddle it over in your mind? Let's go on. As I already indicated earlier this morning, there is a hard copy. They want them off. Now, if you recall, I said we wanted to look at World War I, and of course the aftermath of the preceding chart. So that's what we're going to do. You can lay it out actually in terms of three parts, what they call the plans and execution phase. You can organize it in this fashion. It's not unusual. And here I'm referring to the Schlieffen Plan and the French Plan 17. Okay, they were implemented, or the beginning of their implementation was in August 1914 here. They pretty much washed out by that October. And in its place came so-called trench warfare, the stagnation phase. And then, for lack of a better word, the spring of 1918 and beyond, the finale of the final phase. So it's not an unusual breakout, so we'll look through it, through this breakout, this organization. We'll treat them in order, plans and execution, stagnation, and finale. So let's do that. Now, if we look at the Schlieffen Plan, it's a good vehicle for observing that first part. Why, what I'm showing you here is a schematic of the way it actually unfolds, not necessarily the way it was designed. Some of you people have read some military history and the pros and cons, or we should have gone this way and that way. I don't want to get into that argument. But basically what we have here, we see 5 armies pivoting on Neptune. And the idea was to get in behind the Allied armies, put them in a bag, isolate them, and of course, terminate the war. Naturally, that didn't work out. The chart also indicates. So, what am I really trying to depict here? Basically, what I'm showing you is a large-scale single envelopment scheme. It's called a large-scale or a gigantic single envelopment scheme. And we talked about nuclear light. Now we're seeing a very vast, much vaster scale than we've seen it before. So that's all I want you to remember. Single envelopment, kind of a scheme there. You see that coming about. Also, obviously, you see in here, I normally don't bring it out, but it brings in the nature of unequal distribution of your forces in order to gain leverage. As a matter of fact, that's one of the criticisms why the plan failed. Sufficient unequal distribution of forces in order to make it work. In other words, initially they did was then they start modifying the plan. Now with that in mind, let's look a little deeper. The action and reactions unfold. What we see, these offenses, like that one for example, were conducted on wide frontages. But however, they tended to emphasize few rather than many harmonious independent thrusts. In other words, these thrusts, like Amy showed in the previous chart, they all had to work in lockstep with one another, work together. In other words, they tend to work together. Now, why did people tend to do that? Why did commanders want to do that? Because they were very much concerned about protecting their flanks. In other words, they didn't want to get a flank shot at them, so they wanted those units all working at the same pace, or the same rate of movement. But if you think about that, if everybody's going to operate at the same pace, then if anybody gets held up, that means all of them are held up. Not only that, or if one operates at a slower pace, you're going to move the pace of the slowest unit. Isn't that a notion of predictability? Obviously. You become more predictable. And also gives your adversary longer time in order to sort himself out. The other point is, if everybody's operating with the same character, you also become more predictable. Everybody's operating at the same pace. All your operations are going to appear alike, all the other ones. So you're not only slower, but you're more predictable, more evident, more obvious. So if you see one aspect, pretty soon you can extrapolate and understand the rest of the aspect. So what happens when somebody gets in trouble, or a unit gets in trouble since they want to free them up, they start feeding reserves. If the other guy starts feeding reserves, you get both sides feeding reserves, now you got a bloodbath. Somebody gets hung up, okay, pump in the reserve. The other guy didn't want to, he pumps his reserve in, so now you get this huge bloodbath taking place. I mean, it's strength smashing into strength. Basically what happens. Very simple. Okay, the reaction to this, your defense is organized into what we call belts of fortified terrain, trench warfare. The key ingredients, artillery and machine guns. So if somebody comes on, you lay on the artillery fire. If they come in deeper, you pour in a machine gun fire. So after many casualties are pinned down, then you throw in a counterattack and throw them out. It's done over and over again. Over and over again. And the result, not too surprising. Not too surprising. Example, Battle of Somme, 1916. Very small sector of the front. The British had a 1 week